starting to record, and then we will start bringing people in to 10:30. And as usual, Rosalind, you have been on a number of these, I know, but I always say, raise a hand and all that sort of stuff, and try and be a little bit more informal, a little bit more interactive, rather than stuffy.
I have a few slides simply because
no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I mean, do you want to bring them up now and see if they work, or is there an introductory slide just to make sure it works, make sure the tech works?
Sort of title slide I put at the beginning. Right, how do I?
Just share.
How do I share?
On the top right, does it say share with a little up arrow?
Oh yeah, it does. God, I'm being stupid. Sorry.
That's right.
You'd think by now I'd know. Right. When.
I mean, even a penguin could do it, couldn't? I mean,
Does that work?
That's worked. Yeah, I can see that. Yep, that's really good. Okay, so what I'll do, just leave it up. I'll start admitting people, go through a bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get it sorted. So let me just start admitting people. So here we go. Admit everyone. There we go. Good morning. Morning, David. Morning, Ian. Morning, Amanda. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be brilliant to cut out some background noise. We can then get started. Thank you very much. Morning, Elaine. Morning, Gareth. Morning, Jerry. Morning, Jim. Morning, John. Morning, Andrew. Good morning, Amanda. Let's just bring a few others in. Morning, Hannah. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be fantastic to allow the wonderful Rosalind to talk. Let's just admit a few more. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Let's just meet a few other people joining as well. Admit. Oh, cancel that. Admit. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be great. Caroline, I'm going to mute you, Caroline, if that's. Oh no, you've done it. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you very much. And then we're nearly ready to start. Let's just check that Rosalind is all ready to go. Yep. Good, fine, excellent. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. We've had a lot of interest in this one, and this is to do with Lifetime Allowance. And if you haven't been on a coffee morning before, the format is an informal presentation with a lot of obviously technical knowledge from the wonderful Rosalind. But we're going to record the session. So can we have a thumbs up from everybody that we can record? Rosalind, you're happy with that? David, you're happy with that? I will monitor the lobby. If you'd like to ask a question, then please raise a hand at any time. Because, as I say, we'd like to be interactive on the coffee mornings for Pension Playpen. And if you'd like to enter any comments in the chat, then we'll open up the chat as well. So without any further ado, Rosalind, I'm going to pass to you, and you can explain to us what have you found with your deep dive into the Lifetime Allowance.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve. If for any reason I fail to notice someone's hands raised, I'm going to rely on Steve to interrupt me and tell me I'm missing something. So Lifetime Allowance, I've done some slides on this, but just because it's tax, and if I don't do slides, it'll make your ears bleed. So have, that's just have a little bit of a thought around it. I'm going to talk through a little bit of what has come in, and then end on what I think is a really interesting thing, which is what might we get in the future. And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think any of us do, but it would be lovely to chat about that particularly, I think. So, Lifetime Allowance. This is what the Chancellor of the Exchequer said in his budget speech this year. I will go forward and abolish the Lifetime Allowance. It is a pension tax reform that will stop over 80% of NHS doctors from receiving a tax charge. Well, I've had the enjoyment of spending some time with NHS doctors over recent weeks, and I certainly don't want to mean there's a tax charge to them, particularly given the things they've been doing to me. So it would be nice, wouldn't it? But we'll come on to the sort of reasoning for it later, because I think that is actually quite interesting. But this is what he said. I think, like everybody else, I dropped what I was holding when that was said. I was not expecting this. He'd been trailing that it will be increased, and the annual allowance would probably be increased, which indeed he also did. But the abolition was not what anyone was expecting to happen. So he went on to say, I'm getting rid of the charge now, but the actual lifetime allowance will dismantle over the course in order to change things for the next tax year. And we'll come on to that future bit later. But to start with, what have we changed now? Now, I'm going to do a boring bit of law here and parliamentary procedure. Law, particularly tax law, is not supposed to be retrospective, which is why we get the budget speech before the beginning of the tax year. But actually, to have the Finance Act in place takes a while, because you've got to have it work like an actor. It has to go through the houses and goes through readings and committee stages and things, and then gets royal assent. So you can't get that straight away. So what you have is the tax bill issued before the end of the tax year, but after the budget speech, the finance bill. But it doesn't actually become an act until it goes through all that process, which will probably be, I don't know, June, but it will be retrospective to the beginning of April. Now, the reason I mention that is because at the moment, we do not have a Finance Act that brings this in. We have a finance bill, but I think we can all be very confident that that will be what the Act says, because it's a basic convention that people don't mess with finance bills, because that means that you're doing retrospective tax, which is bad. So fundamentally, unless something really ridiculous happens, I'm very apologetic that my phone just decided to go off. I'm going to have to turn that off. So fundamentally, we're looking at a bill now, which is not an act of parliament. Sorry, I'm just turning my phone off so that doesn't happen again. We are looking at a bill now, which is not an act of parliament, but we're going to assume that that is the law, and that is what the law will say. So what we have now is a bill that has as its first important section, Section 18. Section 18 is the one that gets rid of the lifetime allowance. Now, how does it get rid of the lifetime allowance? It gets rid of the lifetime allowance, it gets rid of the lifetime allowance charge by this provision that says a lifetime allowance charge won't arise for this year or any future tax year. The lifetime allowance charge isn't getting rid of the lifetime allowance, and it specifically says the rest of the pension tax rules, which is basically part 4 of the 04 Act. So all the changes we've ever had to the tax law since A-Day has just played into part 4 and the surrounding schedules. The rest of that will still continue, quotes, for the purposes other than determining a person's liability for the lifetime allowance charge. Now, when I first looked at that, I thought, oh my God, so does that get rid of BCEs and BCE reporting? Because don't you just do those for a liability for lifetime allowance charge? And I think the answer to that is no. We have to interpret this in a very narrow way, i.e. for the purposes, if it's for the purposes of determining a person's lifetime allowance, that still stays. But if it's for the purposes of determining their liability to pay the tax, it doesn't. So it basically just gets rid of that little bit that says tax is due and this is how much. The reason for that becomes obvious when you look at Section 19, because Section 19 has said that some things that used to be subject to the lifetime allowance charge are now going to be subject to a different tax instead, basically to income tax. And it's specifically looked at some lump sums. Now, obviously, that's good news for those people, because lifetime allowance charge for lump sums is 55%, and your income tax charge is going to be lower than that. But you basically charge at marginal income tax rate on certain lump sums where otherwise you would be subject to a lifetime allowance charge. And these sums are here set out. Now, if you think about it, that means you still need to calculate someone's lifetime allowance. You need to calculate what's left and work out what your BCEs take you to. Because, for instance, if I had someone in my pension scheme and I was and they were retiring, I need to work out and report on the BCE and the effect on the lifetime allowance. Because what I don't know is if in 6 months' time they're going to get a terminal diagnosis and want to take
the best area.
Want to take a serious ill health lump sum payment from another scheme they have, and need to know whether they've got any of that will be in excess of lifetime allowance. Because if so, it's subject to income tax. So the short version is the effect of this retention, even though these people are not being charged with the lifetime allowance charge, the effect of its existence is that we still need to be doing these calculations, because otherwise nobody would know whether this income tax charge would apply. And I think that's quite interesting, because what I don't know is whether this is a stopgap or whether this is the way that the government is going to, or HMRC are going to want to run things in the future. In which case, an awful lot of stuff we do largely for lifetime allowance charge will continue. So I think that is really quite interesting. I'm briefly going to mention the really fiddly bit, and this one certainly made my brain hurt when I thought about it. One of the things that was retained and was clearly set out in the Chancellor's speech and the accompanying papers as retained is the limit on your pension commencement lump sum. Now, the point about that is your pension commencement lump sum limits are connected to the lifetime allowance. So, for instance, pre these changes, my pension commencement lump sum is going to be the lower of 25% of the fund that I have and 25% of my lifetime allowance. If I am someone with a higher lifetime allowance, then it will be 25% of that number, not the sort of standard lifetime allowance. And if I'm someone with a protected lump sum, so you may remember there are some people who, when A-Day came in, had a higher percentage as their lump sum protected. If I've got that protection, then it'll be that percentage rather than 25%. So if you don't want to think through or remember all that, that's fine. The important point to take from that is your pension commencement lump sum amount, the limits to it, are connected to your lifetime allowance. So when we were told that that limit was staying in place, it was important to understand that that means lifetime allowance still sort of applies. So as of 6th of April this year, your pension commencement lump sum is the lower of two calculations. One is 25% of the fund you've got, or X% of the fund you've got if you have a protected lump sum percentage which is higher. It's the lower of that, and 25% of your lifetime allowance on the 5th of April 2023, or the higher protected lump sum amount you had as at 5th of April 2023. So if you had fixed protection, which gave you a lifetime allowance of 1.8 million, say, then it's 25% or whatever your percentage is of that as your limit, not 25% of the actual lifetime allowance of just over £1 million. The 25% of the lifetime allowance that operated on the 5th of April 2023 is 268,000 and a bit, because that's 25% of the lifetime allowance, which is a bit over £1 million. So if I had a higher lifetime allowance because I had a fixed protection, that limit wouldn't be 268 grand, it would be 25% of that higher LTA. So what Section 23 says is that if you already had a fixed or enhanced protection, those are the types of protections of your lifetime allowance position that gives you a fixed number. If you had that at the time of the 2023 budget, then your lump sum limit relates to that lifetime allowance, not to the £1 million. Bearing in mind that if your fund is still less than that it's that number that applies, but it's 25% of that higher number. So if you've got that protection, you still keep that benefit. They want to make sure that benefit isn't lost. But here's the interesting thing. You may remember if you have a fixed or enhanced protection, the big thing is you're not allowed to accrue any further benefits under the scheme, under any scheme. And that's where people get nervous about being auto-enrolled and suddenly losing their benefits or all sorts of things. I think anybody who's ever worked in that environment will have found that to be a problem. Can people still hear me? Because my internet seems to have died suddenly.
I can still hear you, Rosalind. The presentation's disappeared, but
Yes.
we've got a hand raised from Karen. Karen, do you want to unmute and ask your question at this juncture? Well, oh, there we go. The slides come back as well.
I can't go visual because I haven't got a camera. I can see you're about to get onto some of the complications of fixed protection. But before that, going back to the PCLS bullets, I get really worried about this one because the Chancellor's gone on and on about this overall cap, and indeed the fact that the LTA will be fixed for people with all the protections. But what he's not particularly reminding is the fact that it's 25% per fund. I think lots of individual members will miss that, and that's pretty key. And I just thought I'd raise with that second bullet, 25% of the individual's remaining lifetime allowance.
Yes.
And
yes.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be picky because that'd be pointless because I know you notice that. But I guess it's tying in with your previous slide about BCEs and why they carry on mattering. Because
people
every
need
time
to report that, don't they? Yes.
They have to report every time you have a BCE, whether or not you take a PCLS within that BCE, you're using up some of your lifetime allowance and therefore reducing the amount of scope potentially, if you're a high pension person, a future PCLS. And that kind of is hidden away in all these other things going on. The government haven't highlighted the fact that with this frozen target, what you do this year may impact what you can take as tax-free cash sum next year, but we've got no idea how. And for the moment, it's the old rules and the BCEs that are eating into your PCLS scope.
And that's interesting. I think that's really fascinating because when you look at the examples in the first bit of guidance we've got out of HMRC, they're all, and I noticed this, they're all talking about you having one pension with one person and taking one number. Even though they do some quite complicated other things. I think you're absolutely right. They're trying to skirt round that point, but you're absolutely right. It's what your LTA is because subject. Yes, when I say the individual's LTA, I mean what you got left, guys, which is absolutely right. It is the remaining amount. I think you're absolutely right. Since things are back up, I will carry on that, but thank you. That's a very good point. So here's the interesting thing, I think, is that there seems to be an idea that people might still apply for protections. I'm not sure how many people care that much about their PCLS, but maybe they do, in order to obtain this higher limit on your PCLS. Now, the latest fixed protection, 2016 fixed protection, is still available. So it is still open to apply for. Technically, you can apply for other ones, but that's in very, very limited circumstances because basically there were deadlines and you need a reason to get past them. And generally, there aren't any reasons that are acceptable to the powers that be. But if you still apply for a protection, the suggestion is you can still apply for a protection. And if you do, you'll get that higher PCLS limit because it'll apply. They will then, if you like, back apply rather than saying the individual's LTA, remaining LTI, at the 5th of April 23, it'll say that individual's remaining LTA subject to this higher limit that now applies because you've gone for fixed protection. But if you do it, if you make that application now, then all those things about not accruing benefits, which used to apply to old fixed protections and enhanced protections, do apply to you. So the reason I query how much people are going to do this, and I think I wonder if they're thinking far too many people have applied for this and it's been an absolute pain, it's not so attractive because all it's doing is protecting your PCLS, and you're the only people who can't accrue benefits anymore. Now, obviously, you might not want to accrue benefits anymore, but given that there isn't a lifetime allowance charge, and it's likely that there won't be a lifetime allowance limit in any form on you in the future, do you really want to bother to go for a protection just for that lump sum? I don't know, but people may want to do so. But if they do, they'll be the only people who can't do any more accrual. So that's what we've got at the moment in the legislation. That's the 2023 Finance Act number 2. This, I think, is the really interesting stuff. What about the future? So we've been told that the lifetime allowance charge has been removed and that the lifetime allowance itself will be dismantled. Although the term dismantled seems to be used less and less, and it's unclear how much dismantling will happen. I think to work out what's going to happen in the future, obviously the best solution to work out what's happening in the future is to wait until the future happens. But I'm increasingly hearing questions of people saying, well, should we advise people to think that this will change in a year's time, or that this will change at this point? And I think there is a lot of uncertainty around what the Chancellor has said and what he meant and what he might mean in the future when he's actually looked at it, and what might change when he's no longer Chancellor. So the first thing I think worth looking at, why did we get rid of the LTA charge in the first place? Well, what that quote from the Chancellor said was, in order to help people, and in fact it was referenced more than once, and they specifically mentioned doctors, but they mentioned other people who might be incentivized to give up work because of the charges on their pension. Now, my understanding, when there was a lot of noise a few years ago about doctors saying, I don't particularly want to go back to work when I'm coming to retirement, because if I just do a little bit of work, I suddenly hit with all these pension tax charges, was mostly about the annual allowance charge. The annual allowance charge is one of those taxes. You also get it with deferred remuneration tax charges and some options, etc., that people really don't like, because it's when you're being charged tax on money you don't have. Lifetime allowance charge is on money you have, in the sense that you are paid some money and actually you have to give some of that back, or some of that is retained to pay the tax. If I'm subject to an income tax charge of, I don't know, 70%, I may be unhappy, but at least all that means is I get a smaller income. It doesn't mean that someone is charging me money for a thing I haven't got. And the problem with the annual allowance, and I understand happened to people, particularly with doctors who had very strong, very long service, if they did work in a DB scheme, the way that the accrual worked meant that they'd be subject to an annual allowance charge on the accrual. And the accrual means they're not getting the money. And you were getting people whose net income after tax from the work they were doing was entirely being swallowed by then having to pay the annual allowance charge. So effectively, they're saying, why would I work? Because I'm working, and the effect of it is that my pension goes up. Great, but I haven't got my pension. The effect of it is I net have to pay the government money to work. I'm not getting a salary. That is obviously an issue for people. But that's about the annual allowance. So as I understand it, that was the biggest complaint. I'm not saying people wouldn't like to not have a lifetime allowance, but in that particular problem, the annual allowance was the issue. And certainly the annual allowance is something I've seen over the years, people writing policy papers saying, well, why don't we get rid of it? Because, you know, if you want to stop people over saving in their pension, if your reason for taxing pension is to make sure that people use it genuinely as a pension, not just as a safe place to store money, then surely you care about the size of the pot overall, not how it got there. The reason the annual allowance was originally much, much higher was to understand that there are some people who have some years where they've got loads of spare cash and other years where they don't have any. So, you know, if you work in something like that, you want to not put money in for 5 years and then put a whole bunch in. So the annual allowance ought to be high. Query, should the annual allowance be there? So it's interesting that the annual allowance, obviously it's gone up, but it's not gone up to anything like as high as it originally was at A-Day. Annual allowance is still in place, and the lifetime allowance is the one removed. If that is what you're trying to achieve, I'm not sure it gets you there, I suppose is my point. I do wonder if part of the motivation behind this, or possibly just part of the motivation of the people in Treasury signing it off, is the cost reward ratio, the cost benefit analysis. I was told when I started off as a lawyer that the government's favourite tax is stamp duty, because stamp duty is a voluntary tax. You don't have to pay it. It's just if you don't pay it, there are certain things you're not allowed to do. Like if you buy a property, you don't have to pay stamp duty, but if you don't, you can't register your ownership. So you can't get a mortgage and you'll have difficulty proving you own it and it'll be really hard to sell. But you don't have to pay the tax. And because it's a voluntary tax, people self-police. So the government doesn't have to spend a lot of time chasing people and harassing people for their failure to pay it. So you don't really have to make much money from stamp duty as a government for the Treasury to like that as a tax, because the reward compared to the cost of managing it is extremely high. And obviously that's the right way for the Treasury to think. I would like tax collection to be efficient, because that reduces the amount of tax that we all have to pay. So it's obviously, I'm not criticizing it, but that is an analysis that goes on, and it's not a political analysis at all. I do wonder if the LTA charge is expensive and doesn't bring in a great deal. If you look at the LTA structure as a whole, which initially we were told was going to be completely dismantled, it's quite a complex thing, of course, and it's a lot of effort for us, but it's also quite a lot of effort for HMRC. They've got all this notifications coming in. They're keeping an eye on all this stuff. They're having to check this number against that number the whole time. And then, of course, there are all the protections. My goodness, there are hundreds of different protections people can apply for, and they apply for them, and the government will give them, the HMRC will award them to you, or maybe they won't, because they'll say you're out of time, and then you sue, and then you end up in the tribunals, and then they probably win, or they might not win in certain circumstances. And it's expensive. It's very time consuming and therefore expensive for HMRC to run. And because of all these protections, an awful lot of people don't pay the lifetime allowance charge. Now, that's not to say that nobody pays it. I know there are people who pay it, and it's very expensive for them often when they do. And we've all of us who work in the industry will have come across people paying a lot of money in this. But in the round, in the total, it is not bringing in money from a lot of people who would be liable for it, because they've got the protections that the government's put in place. So I do wonder if somebody looked at the numbers and said, you know what, if we count all the costs of all the BCE reporting and all the analysis and all the other stuff around the protections that HMRC does, and we count the revenue we receive from the LTA charge, it's not cost effective. And that makes it an attractive tax to just remove. So I don't know. I throw that out there. I think that may be part of someone's analysis. And the reason I mentioned those two potential stimulants to this decision is, of course, they result in a very different approach to the dismantling. If all I care about is assisting workers of making sure people aren't put off working because they're worried about their lifetime allowance, once I've removed the charge, I don't need to do anything else. I've literally, anything else doesn't really make a great deal of difference to that. If, however, my worry is about the cost to revenue ratio, then I want to look at dismantling stuff as much as I can. Now, that's not to say that all stuff will be dismantled, but it does make me think that if that is part of the reason why this was done, it's more likely that we'll see quite a lot of dismantling going on. So what are the problems with the just getting rid of it all? Well, I think the really interesting thing is I have noted that the notes to the finance bill, the explanatory notes that you get with all acts of parliament, particularly ones around tax, do not say that the rest of it will go by the next tax year. It will say further, it says further actions will be taken in a future finance bill. And I did wonder if nobody wants to be a hostage to fortune, and or somebody at HMRC has said, not unreasonably, this is actually quite complicated, you know, very complicated. And so the idea that we'll definitely get it all done before the next finance bill, I mean, in your dreams, mate. So I do wonder if there is a likelihood this gets pushed back anyway, because it's complicated. A lot of stuff about... Yes, sorry.
Just to say that Billy has had his hand raised for a little while. Billy, do you want to ask your question? And then I think Stephanie had her hand raised as well. So Billy, do you want to come in first, and then, or maybe ladies first, Stephanie? I mean, I think I'm sure Billy would give way to you, Stephanie, if you want to unmute.
Yep. No, that's fine.
Okay, Stephanie, do you want to go first? And if you unmute Stephanie as well, that'd be great. Okay, I can't hear you, Stephanie. So, Billy, do you want to ask your question, and then we'll try and come back to Stephanie.
Okay, right. Good. Well, thank you, Rosalind. So, as an advisor, we've got some interesting bits of advice coming up. So, can I give you a typical scenario? So, let's take somebody who's got a £2 million pension pot. So they've crystallised up to the lifetime allowance and taken the tax-free cash. So they've just got just over £1 million. And obviously they're over the age of 55. So the consensus from a lot of advisors is that with that client, you would advise them to simply crystallise the remaining £1 million, go into drawdown, and you don't even have to take any income. So then, because you're fully crystallized, you're outside the LTA. But then, if Labour get in next year or in a couple of years and then reintroduce some sort of lifetime allowance, because you're fully crystallized, do you see any way that they could come back and impose an LTA tax?
I was actually going to come on to what the Labour Party position in a little while, actually, because I think that is part of this, what might happen in the future. Because I think, to come on to that point, I don't know. The Labour Party has been clear that they are going to, they don't agree with this and they're going to put this back in. My own view is that if there is the simple answer is, as a matter of law, you can make the tax law say whatever you like. They've given us all fair warning that they might do that. So is it possible? Yes. I would think, actually, what I perceive Labour doing is reviewing this and restructuring it. I don't see it likely that Labour will say, oh, let's just act as if nothing happened on the 6th of April 2023, because apart from the fact that just annoys everybody, this is the opportunity to review a system that's been in place for the better part of 20 years, which we all know doesn't work perfectly and is fiddly in certain places and has some unintended consequences, and just restructure it in a different way. So I think when Rachel Reeves says we will reimpose this, I think what she's saying, or what I believe that probably means, is if we have a Labour government come in and this is still a policy, and I think it's probably quite likely to be, because I think it ticks the right political boxes, it won't be that we'll just reinsert what was there before. What we'll look at is ways to tax large pension pots. And that may include pension pots where people have, as you say, taken advantage of the present system to put themselves in a place where the LTA doesn't apply, which I suspect a number of people are likely to do. So do I think that there's something Labour might do there? Yeah, I do. I just don't think it's going to be as straightforward as they'll just reimpose everything. I think they'll look at it in the round. I think that, to me, is the sensible thing to do. And that's what they'll probably be advised to do, rather than just try and go backwards, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
I mean, that's helpful, because that's our best guess. Thank you, then.
Thanks for the question, Billy. Stephanie, do you want to try you first, and then we'll come to The next question after that, Stephanie, do you want to? Is your mic working now? Oh. Okay, well, let's go to Karen
Steve,
then. Karen?
Steve, could I just, before we do that, would you mind if I just did 3 or 4 minutes just finishing off this bit,
finishing off.
and then,
And
then
then
I
we'll
can
do
take the slides
Q&A.
down,
Yeah,
I can see
yeah.
people properly, if
That's
that's all
fine.
right.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yep.
So what I was just going to say is the BCE notifications are used by HMRC for a bunch of things, not only for LTA. So I think they're going to want, and just to give an example, if you had an overseas pension scheme that's qualifying and gets migrant members relief, you have to report BCEs just largely so that they can monitor that you're doing the kind of things that UK pension schemes do. But that's, as far as I can tell, that's what that's for. So HMRC may not want to give up getting that information. And I think if that's the case, we'll probably find that some form of BCE notification continues, or they may, as I was saying, Labour might do, they may just rehaul it and do it in a different way. And I also wonder if those replacement lump sum charges are a temporary measure, because obviously if they're not, we're going to still need all the same notifications. And the lump sum provisions are temporary, because again, if not, we're going to need to understand things, we're going to need notifications. Are we going to in fact see that in fact the same structure stays in place, but maybe there are more things that were going to be subject to, used to be subject to annual allowance limits, or sorry, lifetime allowance limits or charges, which are now going to get different charges instead. So I think it's unlikely that we'll have a complete sweep away. And I think that largely because I suspect HMRC doesn't want it. I think a lot of stuff will stay in place. And then the point that, given Billy's point earlier, what would the Labour Party do? Labour has been very clear they're going to reinstate this. I think it's, I don't think it's unreasonable in the current political environment to say it's not unlikely we end up in 18 months' time with a different party in power. And politically, I think you can run a very successful line saying this is about, this is about saving tax for people who have a lot of money. And we can argue about how true that is, but that is a perfectly valid political line to run. So I think it's likely that they would look to reimpose something and get some political capital out of that, but I don't think they'd reverse out. So I think if you have clients who are assuming that in a year's time it's all gone, that's brave. And I think if you have clients who assume that in 18 months, if Labour gets back in, it'll all be reversed, that's brave. I think there is a great deal of uncertainty. We'll end up somewhere in the middle with what's taken away. And if Labour reinstate, they'll reinstate something different. So we can't really act for that. I'm going to try to stop sharing now. Oh, how do you think I do that?
Just go to the share icon and says should give you stop sharing.
Yeah, sorry, it refused to allow me to see that page at all. There we go.
Richard, do you want to ask your question? Richard Chilton?
Yes, if I could, please. I'm a bit confused about how the whole thing works at the moment. Take a situation where 15 years ago, somebody crystallised their pension fund, took a PCLS of £270,000, basically. They would then get a figure of the percentage of the lifetime allowance they've used. But obviously, at that point, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have any bank account records of what on earth you'd taken by way of the PCLS, basically. So I'm a bit confused of what happens going forward. So if somebody's got another pension fund, they take some money from that. How does it work as to what, if any of that, is taxable by? See, is there a PCLS? How much, if any, PCLS can be taken now? Do we know what the rules are now?
So the rules on that would be, in that particular example, the rules on that would be the amount they could take is 25% of that fund they're now taking, or if lower, 25% of their remaining LTA as at 5th of April 23. So there should be a record of how much of their lifetime allowance got used up with that earlier pension. So if in that example, if they used up, I don't know, half their lifetime, they used up 750 grand of lifetime allowance. The lifetime allowance, if they've never taken a protection, they've got left is 250 grand. So I wish I'd used an easier number than that. So their PCLS limit is 25% of that 250 grand, or if lower, 25% of the fund that they're taking now. So that's the way you calculate it. You don't need to know how much money they took historically. You just need to know what amount of their lifetime allowance is left, if that makes sense.
Right. So long as you've got the right amount of lifetime allowance left there, so you're then, so it's the percentage basically that. So it's the percentage based on what the last lifetime allowance was basically there.
Yeah.
That's the way that it works. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and the percentage of what they're actually taking. So it's still the 25% of what you're actually taking now is still also a limit. So it's the lower of those two.
And do you know, is this written down anywhere so that people can go and sort of look at it and check it basically?
Well, actually, the HMRC's latest did a newsletter on lifetime allowance guidance newsletter on the 27th of March this year, which runs through some examples. And I thought that was really, really helpful in sort of working out how the lifetime allowance is affecting lump sums now. So that's where I look.
Yeah, and Richard, you work for Citizens Advice Bureau, which is a fantastic role.
Yes.
If you get that document, it might be an idea to share that with all the branches, because a lot of people will definitely be in an awkward situation. So that'd be a good document to share, I think. Rosalind, would you agree?
Yeah. I work on just the pension-wise bit basically, but sure. It is interesting. Some of the things I looked at, I think I spotted that one before. They did cover other circumstances there. I don't know if it's covered the one that I've.
No, I'm not sure if they've got specifically that circumstance, but I think it's difficult because the pensions tax manual hasn't been updated yet, and it will be, but that always takes ages, and they don't tend to do it before the finance bill becomes an act. So, but in a way, what you're doing is you're combining what it says in that, which actually talks more generally about the scenario of if I've taken some lifetime allowance before, if I've taken some of my lifetime allowance before and I'm taking some now, what happens to my lump sum? And that really still, in some ways, that still applies, actually. For lump sums, the old rules basically are still applying. But what we're taking is your lifetime allowance at the 5th of April this year, not your lifetime allowance now this moment. So in some ways, it means sort of doing a bit of mental gymnastics, but you can combine the two and make that work, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot for that. Yeah.
Richard, if you look in the chat, Ian Beeston's very kindly put that link up for the gov.uk part of the site where you can get that newsletter. So thanks, Ian, for doing that. And I think Karen Goldschmidt has helped on that as well. So thanks for your question, Richard. Karen, do you want to ask your question or make your point? Or
thank you. So I'm going back to this question about Labour, and if I can raise two questions. The first one is they've now given us a warning that they're going to do something. We're always being told that pensions tax can't, well, that there is something in law, whether it's human right law or whatever, that tax can't be retrospective, and you've quoted that. The fact that they've said they're going to do something, does that in any way give them a stronger ground for being retrospective? And adding on to that, I'm hoping the answer is no, but I'm just putting that out there. And then specifically thinking about the position of trustees making decisions at the moment, there are various projects where whether or not projects where trustees might do something without members' consent in an ideal world because it's efficient and it's generally a good outcome. But we know there are pitfalls that mean that people, certainly under the legislation in place before 6th of April, would have lost fixed protection if they had it. Now, once the bill's through, retrospectively, in theory, they won't lose fixed protection. We've got this, so hopefully this opens up the doors for all sorts of useful projects. But we've got this worry that Labour have said that they're going to unwind, or something or other, the removal of the lifetime allowance charge. So the scenario I would worry about, and I'd like it to be that the lawyers say, don't worry about this, because how can you anyway predict the futures? Trustees carry out an exercise, it loses a member fixed protection, down the road, Labour bring back the lifetime allowance charge. They do the same thing that previous governments have done. They put in a new level of protection, but that level of protection only reflects where you are when they bring this lifetime allowance in, and therefore any advantage you'd had from fixed protection is in some way lost. Now, do you think though that sort of convoluted worry should be influencing trustees at the moment, or can they embrace this nice new world and get on with these projects?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, because I think people sometimes people the whole point about retrospectivity, I think people overplay slightly sometimes, in the sense that when we talk about law not being retrospective, and you're right, it's actually a parliamentary convention, so it's not as such. You can pass a law doing that, but convention says we mustn't. Okay, so we don't. But what basically it means is that I'm not supposed to pass a law now that affects, that basically catches you out for things you did last year. But tax law in that way doesn't mean that you can't be taxed now on money that you hold, where you made a decision about the way you held that money because of the way tax law was at that time. So, you know, for instance, I recall in George Osborne's, I think, last budget speech, he made a particular charge that operated with certain types of family settlements. It appeared largely because it had come to the press that the Miliband brothers had that family settlement, and he was trying to emphasize it. And I worked at the time with a lot of private client lawyers who got really angry about it because it was causing them a lot of grief. But the point is, it is absolutely legitimate for a government to pass a law saying, I am going to tax this structure that you had in place. So I don't think the mean that you can't do things retrospectively stops people then turning around and saying, okay, you all organise your tax this way because they got rid of the lifetime allowance, and we're now going to tax the benefits you have. That doesn't stop you doing that. What it isn't going to be easy to do is to simply say, we're going to look at all those BCEs that happened in the last year and tax people as if the lifetime allowance charge applied during that year. So I don't think Labour can just react as if the things people have done would have been taxed as they did them, but they can tax people now in structures they've put in place because of these changes. So that's a convoluted way of saying, in answer to your questions, no, I do not think Labour telling us that they are going to reintroduce this counts as not making something retrospective. I agree on that. The nearer something is to tax law, the more explicit you have to be about that. Old people may remember that when the pensions regulators' powers came in, they were retrospective before the date of the Act coming into force to the date of the earlier draft of the legislation. And the government had originally wanted to put it back to the white paper and were told it wasn't explicit what would happen enough in that to allow them that degree of retrospectivity. So I don't think anything Rachel Reeves has said has got her anywhere near being able to do that. So I think that's fine. I would agree that it's quite difficult for trustees to say, oh, but Labour will reverse this and therefore we do need to worry about these things, because it's quite explicit what is happening to fixed protections. It's not actually that fixed protection is going away, it's that you don't lose fixed protection by future accrual or by the transfers or by all those things that we were worried about losing it before. It explicitly says that. So I'm actually quite comfortable about doing those things. I think there is always a risk that the government may turn round and say, people who hold money in this way, we're going to tax them. And so some of those people are going to be taxed anyway. But I don't think the government can say that act that you did last year when we weren't in power, we are now taxing that act. So I think trustees should be relaxed to follow what the law currently says on this. I don't think it's appropriate for them to, I almost think if trustees decide not to do something because the law might change, that's not really doing what they ought to be doing. So I think they shouldn't worry about Labour's actions in that way, because I don't think Labour can penalise previous acts, but it can just tax us all, or tax everyone with money worth more than a certain amount, or everyone whose name begins with an R, or whatever.
Thanks. Okay.
Fantastic. Cheers, Rosalind. Stephanie, you've got your hand raised. Shall we see if your mic works now? And if
Hello.
not, we can. Oh,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Does that
we
work?
can hear you.
Brilliant. So I'm in my sort of late 30s. I've worked with DB clients throughout my career. And perhaps I fantasize that I've been in a similar position to people that are retiring now and worrying about sort of the calculations that we're discussing at the moment. I think and you've just discussed sort of explicitly what will and won't happen. And I think, Rosalind, you sort of at the end of your discussion, you alluded to sort of the fairness of this policy. And I think when you read the policy paper, it specifically talks about encouraging inactive individuals to return to work. It talks about it benefiting people between the ages of 50 and 64 who have reported that the main driver to leave the labour market was effectively some form of tax optimization, I guess. When you dig deeper and you go to the bottom of the policy paper, they specifically talk about equality's impact, and they call out that it's going to have a greater impact on benefit to those later in life and closer to retirement. The people, it's more likely to impact men than women. And it also talks about people that who's likely to pay for it in future generations. For me personally, if you then go to the spring budget, and I think it's on, they don't have any allowance for it next year, but for the next 5 years, the tax cost, that I guess the tax relief over the next 5 years for this policy is 4.6 billion. And for me, I guess I feel like my generation is going to be paying for something. So I guess I wanted to challenge sort of the fairness of such an act.
And I'd absolutely agree. They do have to do the sort of analysis of who is impacted by this, and certainly anything that. I've already been somewhat cynical about the argument that they're doing this to help people return to work. I simply think that's about annual allowance, not lifetime allowance. I'm not sure about their numbers, and I do wonder if their numbers of the tax they won't receive takes into account protections that may or may not be in place.
Yeah, and I think that's just for the next 5 years, for example.
Yeah, and I'm slightly, I wonder if they've overstated it. I mean, I think I'm going to quote my mother here, which I apologise for, but my mother once said to me a few years ago when I was complaining about something about government policies and old people, is that she said, well, if other people voted as much as people of my generations, all policies would evolve around you lot, which was a bit harsh, but I think if I am utterly cynical, when you look at a lot of pensions law over recent years, it has been about protecting older voters, because it is perceived that older people care terribly about their pension and will vote in that direction, and that younger people maybe don't care about their pension as much, and younger people are less likely to vote. And I hate to say something that sounds so unfair, But I think that is the case. I don't think this is a particularly, I mean, you know, if I'm being asked for my opinion on this, I think it's disgraceful to get rid of the lifetime allowance. I really think they shouldn't. I think the lifetime, if you are trying to protect people's pensions pots, but allow people to save for their retirement, but not allow people to use their pension as just a really nice tax-free place to avoid inheritance tax, then you do not have the tax structure we have. Over the last few years, it has got worse and worse from that point of view. My personal opinion, I think I'm not pleased that they are making this change. I appreciate that is not a widely held view, that is my personal view on it. So I'm afraid, Stephanie, I'm completely with you with this.
Yeah.
I don't think this is fair or right.
I think it's just, especially when they say sort of, you know, to have the choice to retire at 50, when I feel like I'm never going to have, you know, the same pension pot. And my job is to, you know, create strategies to fund DB pensioners and hedge their liabilities and things like that. It's just a bit scary for me when I see the costs of it. And when it's, I guess when it specifically says in the policy who's going to pay for it and who it's not benefiting. I guess that's why I think maybe Labour would potentially challenge it if they did come to power.
And I think you're right, and that's why I think there's a great political line that can be run there, that means that they can. That I think, which means to me that it's likely that this isn't just a soundbite from Rachel Reeves. This is genuinely likely to be part of Labour policy, because I think politically it can be a winner for them for the reasons we've discussed. But personally, I don't think this is great. Personally, I also think it's really fiddly. But still.
So, Rosalind, we've got a few minutes left. This is your point then to say, well, what would you have done?
I would have raised the annual allowance back to something sensible. I think bringing it down from over 200,000 is ridiculous. If genuinely what I am trying to do is deal with people moving away from work because of annual allowance, I think particularly younger people, that would be helped by that too, because a lot of people with a fluctuating income in younger generations, more people in the gig economy, etc., those people need to be able to put the money in while they can and not when they can't. And I would stop faffing around with the taxation of pensions and start working out how to make sure that people save properly for their retirement. If I could. I think governments think that every chancellor wants to do something clever with pensions, and I wish they'd just stop, personally.
Okay, well, everyone has their opinion, so that's good. I appreciate that. Has anybody got any other questions? Richard, you still got your hand raised, but that may be a technical hand. Anybody have any other questions or points that they'd like to make? Obviously, Rosalind, it's been a fantastic presentation. And there's obviously a political angle here, which is clearly obvious. Peter, you've just raised your hand. Do you want to just quickly ask a question before we wrap up?
Yep. Yes, really, it's just an observation. But I think the problems, he highlighted the NHS problems particularly, which is really has arisen from the import of sort of DC type pension arrangements, thinking in terms of wealth, into a DB environment where the pension was effectively deferred salary. And this has in fact hit particularly long service employees who are slightly higher paid, and you can debate on that, and that this is causing them to say, well, hold on, we entered this job for life on this basis, and look, you're going to hit us with a thumping great tax charge, therefore we're going to avoid it by leaving employment. So that basis.
And I think that's another point. If one had a clean canvas to tax pensions, I wouldn't tax DC and DB the same way. People treat them as a single thing, and you're absolutely right. They're completely different, and they need to be treated differently.
Yeah, good question and a good answer, Rosalind. Absolutely, yeah. So that's Perfectly reasonable statement, I guess. Rosalind, any closing remarks?
Only to say I don't want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. Obviously, I know exactly what to do because I'm not having to do it.
There you go. There you go. So fantastic. Thanks everyone for their questions. Rosalind, that's been an absolutely fantastic session, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. The video will be posted up later today. If you're not a member of Playpen, please join. We have a new voluntary monthly subscription, so you can pay £1, you can pay £5, you can pay £10, whatever you want to pay for being a Playpen member. And we really appreciate your time today, and onward safe travels. As we always say at the end of the Playpen event, let's pray for peace in the East, and let's hope that that sorts itself out. It's can't believe it's now mid-April. So but great session, Rosalind, thank you very much. Next week we are talking about selfies, and they are not from your camera. They are a new idea going around the globe on retirement strategies and retirement flight paths to look at the sort of decumulation in the market. So next week we'll be talking about selfies, and that's going to be quite an interesting session as well, to think again about drawdown. So there we go. Rosalind, that's been fantastic. Thanks so much for everybody there. Great session, everybody, and hope you enjoyed, and be safe and enjoy the rest of your day. And if you can stay on, Rosalind, that'd be great. I've got a question for you. So fantastic. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
That was an excellent session, Rosalind. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
There's some good questions, I thought.
There were some good questions. Yeah, absolutely. You know, so I think Henry's still on. I think Peter. Hang on, let me just there we go. Henry's still on. That's fine. Cool. Yeah, no. So one of the things we want to try is literally to have a 30-second or a 1-minute content from you, sort of post presentation, I guess. So you know, I just wondered if I could ask you a few questions to say, you know, can you summarize the presentation in a few words, and you know, just comment about the questions, and I think the main issues, just literally 30 seconds. That'd be great. So over to you, Rosalind.
Okay. So we covered off the lifetime allowance charge removal and what's already come in or coming in on the new bill, and what's likely to happen in the future. I think there's some interesting discussions about where people get tripped up, but also around the problems from the uncertainty, political uncertainty of what might change in the future, particularly if a Labour government decides to reverse this, and what they might and might not be able to do.
Fantastic. And probably out of all the questions we've had on our session today, what was the most thought-provoking question that you received?
I thought Stephanie's excellent point about how this is not an intergenerationally fair change, and that younger people are the ones who are going to suffer.
I totally agree. And if you had your time, if we had our time again with a new budget, you would want something different, I guess.
Oh yes. I would like to pass a law saying that the chancellors are not allowed to touch pensions taxation for another 20 years.
Perfect. There we go. That's it.
Rosalind, it's Henry here. I'm sorry to come in at this very late hour.
Henry.
I have a burning question about myself.
Go on.
Could you help? Right. I have about 1.5 million. I have a 1.5 million LTI protection, and I've had about 1 million DB. Say I got 600,000 left in DC. Yeah, is my pension tax-free allowance, tax-free lump sum, 25% of my DC pot, or 25% of my remaining LTA?
It's the lower of the two.
The lower of the two. That's all I needed to know. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry to be a pain at the end.
No, it's great to ask me a question I know the answer to.
That's right. It's on social media. They'll all know what your pension pot is now, Henry. You'll be really pleased about that, won't you? So.
Actually, I've got something in the Express saying just that, but Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Thanks very much indeed for the great
Rosalind, thank
session.
you so much. We appreciate it. That's a brilliant session. Thank you very much.
It's great.
And
Thanks,
we'll
Ed.
post a video later on. Really appreciate
Wonderful.
it. Don't forget to
Bye.
send me the penguins.
I will send you penguins.
Yes,
Promise.
thank you. See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.